Close your eyes, just for a moment. Picture the first face you ever trusted, a childhood friend, their laughter, their eyes, the shape of their presence in your life. You can still feel it, can't you? Like sunlight trapped in glass, warm, vivid, intact. Now try to recall something more elusive. A phone number you once dialed every day, a vacation detail from a decade ago, the name of a teacher whose voice once filled your world. What do you find? Not clarity, but fog, a frustrating emptiness. You know the memory existed. You felt it. You lived it. But now, all that remains is a hollow echo, a ghost where a truth used to be. We call this forgetting. We treat it like an error, an annoying glitch in the brain's machinery, a sign of weakness, something to fix. But what if it's not a flaw at all? What if it's the whole point? What if your brain was never built to be a perfect vault, but instead a dark room, a delicate space where life's brightest moments are captured, not on hard drives, but on fragile analog film? In this dark room, every memory begins as a flash, an imprint. But that imprint is only the beginning. To become a memory, it must be developed, bathed in attention, emotion, and time. Only then does it start to take form. Some images, our most joyful, fearful, or intimate moments, develop into sharp, high-contrast prints. Others? They fade, they curl, they wash out under the glare of time. This is transience, the slow, graceful decay of memory. It is the first of what psychologist Daniel Schacter called the 7 sins of memory. And unlike guilt or pride, this sin isn't moral. It's molecular, a product of entropy, not intention. It's biology's quiet surrender to the laws of time. And that brings us face to face with an existential question. If who we are is built on memory, what are we when memory fails? Are we still the same person when the scaffolding of our past begins to rot away? In this first episode of our mini-series, we won't run from this question. We'll chase it. We'll peel back the layers of forgotten time, from dusty 19th century journals to the firing patterns of your hippocampus. We'll perform a forensic autopsy on lost memory. And most importantly, we'll ask, is forgetting simply loss? Or is it a secret function of survival? A hidden gift? Can we learn to remember better? Or should we learn to forget smarter? This is more than an investigation. It's a confrontation with the fragility of identity, with the myth of permanence, with the haunting beauty of being human. Welcome to False Memory Lab, where even what you forget still leaves fingerprints. Let's begin. Before a disease can be understood, its progression must be charted. Before a map can be drawn, the territory must be painstakingly explored, its contours measured. In the mid-19th century, the vast and volatile territory of human memory was considered unmappable. It was the exclusive domain of poets and philosophers, a realm of mystics. To the rational mind of the burgeoning scientific era, memory was an enigma, a ghost in the machine of the body. Philosophers had offered beautiful metaphors for it. Plato imagined a block of wax in the soul, where experiences left impressions of varying depth and clarity. St. Augustine described it as a vast palace, filled with countless storerooms for sensations and ideas. These were poetic, profound insights into the experience of memory, but they were not measurements. They were art, not science. The scientific world, in its disciplined march of progress, could chart the orbits of distant planets and classify the sprawling tree of life. But the inner world of the mind, the very mechanism of our past, remained a wild, untamable frontier. To suggest that something as personal, as subjective, as a fleeting memory could be captured, pinned down, and subjected to the cold, hard logic of mathematics was deemed not just ambitious, but a fundamental category error. How, after all, do you measure a ghost? How do you weigh a whisper from yesterday? This was the intellectual landscape in which a lone German psychologist, a man of profound patience and a near monastic dedication, decided to embark on a radical, almost absurdly ambitious quest. His name was Hermann Ebbinghaus. He was a man possessed by a deceptively simple question that no one else had dared to ask in a scientific way. If memory fades, can we measure the rate of its decay? He was not interested in the content of memory, the emotions, the meanings, the rich tapestry of personal history. He saw these as contaminants, variables that would hopelessly corrupt any pure measurement. He wanted to strip memory down to its most basic mechanical function. He needed to observe the process of forgetting itself, isolated from the powerful and unpredictable influence of meaning. To achieve this, he understood he needed a new kind of experimental tool, something that had never existed before. So, he invented his weapon, a tool of elegant, almost brutal simplicity, the nonsense syllable. He created a new language from scratch, a language with no meaning, no history, and no emotional resonance. These were three-letter combinations, always a consonant, then a vowel, then another consonant. ZOF, KIR, DAX, VUM, BUP. He meticulously crafted over 2,300 of these meaningless trigrams, each written on a separate card. This was his masterstroke, his solution to the problem of contamination. Using real words or poetry would be like testing the purity of a water sample in a dirty glass. The results would be colored by a lifetime of pre-existing associations. But the nonsense syllable was a sterile instrument. It allowed him to study the raw mechanics of memory formation and decay, observing how the mind builds and then dismantles a connection that has no anchor in the world of meaning. For years, in the quiet solitude of his study, Ebbinghaus became his own solitary test subject in one of the most grueling and repetitive experiments in the history of psychology. The process he designed was a monument to methodical rigor and self-inflicted cognitive torment. He would shuffle his decks of cards, creating randomized lists of these meaningless words. Then the ordeal would begin. To the steady, unforgiving tick of a metronome, one syllable every 2.4 seconds, he would read a list aloud, over and over and over again. His own voice, speaking a language of ghosts, was the only sound in the room. After a set number of repetitions, he would turn the cards over and attempt to recall the list from memory. If he made a single error, if one syllable was out of place, the entire process for that list was voided. He would rest and then begin again until he could achieve one perfect, error-free recitation. This was his baseline, a memory perfectly encoded, a structure newly built in his mind. Then the true experiment would start, the quiet, patient observation of its decay. He would set a timer and wait. He would test his recall after a specific interval, a mere 20 minutes, then an hour, then 9 hours, then a day, then 2, then 6, then a full month. At each interval, he measured what was lost, not by what he could recall from scratch, but by a more elegant metric, the time and effort saved in relearning. He would take the same list and begin the process of memorization anew, counting how many repetitions it took to once again reach perfection. The difference between the original learning time and the relearning time was his measure of what remained of the original memory trace, a ghostly echo of the effort he had first expended. Day after day, month after month, he subjected himself to this cognitive ordeal. He was both the architect building the mental structure and the inspector returning later to measure its erosion. He was the cartographer and the territory being mapped, and as he meticulously plotted his data points onto a graph, time on one axis, retention on the other, a shape began to emerge, a curve. For the first time in human history, the ethereal ghost of forgetting was captured, its predictable behavior rendered visible in the clean, undeniable language of mathematics. What he saw was both revolutionary and deeply unsettling. The shape of the curve, now known to every psychology student as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, revealed a brutal truth about the architecture of our minds. The decay of memory is not a slow, gentle, linear process. It is catastrophically fast at the beginning. Ebbinghaus discovered that he forgot more than half of everything he had just perfectly memorized within the first hour. Within a day, nearly two-thirds of the information had vanished. The drop-off was a terrifying cliff. It suggested that our brains are designed for a massive, immediate data dump, acting as a ruthless filter that discards the vast majority of information almost as soon as it enters our consciousness. Then, after this initial, precipitous plunge, the curve began to change. The rate of forgetting slowed dramatically. The curve began to flatten into a long, desolate plateau. The small fraction of information that survived the initial 24-hour purge remained with far greater stability, decaying only very slowly over the subsequent weeks. The photograph faded most in its first day under the sun. Of course, Ebbinghaus's groundbreaking work was not without its own fatal flaw. The very strength of his methodology, the use of meaningless syllables, was also its greatest weakness. By stripping memory of meaning, context, and emotion, did he truly study memory as we experience it? Or did he only study a sterile, mechanical, and artificial subset of it? Critics would later argue, correctly, that real-world memory is not about nonsense. It is a rich, interconnected web of stories, schemas, and emotions. Forgetting the word Zoff is not the same as forgetting a cherished childhood experience. And yet, this criticism does not diminish his achievement. He was not trying to capture the soul of memory. He was trying to capture its shadow, and he succeeded. Hermann Ebbinghaus, alone in his room with his cards and his metronome, proved that the internal world could be measured. He dragged the ghost of memory into the laboratory and forced it to reveal its habits. He provided the first map of the fade, the clinical chart of our mind's most common disease. But a map, however precise, is not the mechanism. A chart of a fever does not explain the virus. Ebbinghaus showed us, with chilling clarity, what happens, but he could not show us why. To understand the why, to witness the biological machinery that drives this elegant curve of decay, we must leave the lonely study of the 19th century and journey into the modern lab, into the very synaptic structures of the brain itself. We must move from the map of forgetting to the neurological autopsy of a lost memory. Hermann Ebbinghaus gave us the map, a stark, elegant curve that charted the predictable decay of a newly formed memory. For the first time, we could see the ghost's shadow, measure its retreat. But a map of a coastline does not explain the tide. A chart of a fever does not reveal the inner workings of the virus. Ebbinghaus showed us, with brutal clarity, what happens. But his solitary experiments in the 19th century could never answer the deeper, more fundamental question: why? To answer that, we must leave his study and enter the wet, electrochemical labyrinth of the brain itself. We must conduct a neurological autopsy on a memory as it fades to witness the biological machinery that drives the Ebbinghaus curve. Our investigation begins in a structure nestled deep within the temporal lobes, a seahorse-shaped curl of neural tissue that acts as the grand, bustling loading dock of our memory, the hippocampus. When you experience something new, a new face, a new fact, a new place, that raw sensory information arrives here first. The hippocampus is not a permanent archive. It is a temporary workbench, a frantic sorting station. Its job is to take the chaotic flood of incoming data and begin the process of binding it together into a coherent, cohesive memory trace known as an engram. Think of it as the darkroom from our earlier metaphor. The hippocampus is the developer, taking the latent image of an experience and making it visible for the first time. We know this, tragically, from individuals whose loading docks were destroyed. The famous case of patient H.M., Henry Molaison, whose hippocampi were surgically removed, provided the starkest proof. After his surgery, H.M. was trapped in a perpetual present. He could hold a thought for a few moments, but as soon as his attention was diverted, the information was gone forever. The workbench was broken. New experiences would arrive, but they could never be processed, never be consolidated, and never be shipped out to the vast warehouse of long-term memory in the neocortex. His condition, anterograde amnesia, demonstrated that without a functioning hippocampus, the creation of new, lasting declarative memories is a biological impossibility. The memories weren't just fading quickly, they were never truly being printed at all. This process of transferring a memory from the fragile, short-term storage of the hippocampus to the more robust, distributed storage of the neocortex is called memory consolidation. It is a slow, mysterious process that can take days, weeks, or even years, and it happens most intensely while we sleep. The hippocampus replays the recent memory trace over and over, effectively teaching the neocortex what to store. It's like a librarian at the new arrivals desk, meticulously creating cross-reference cards and sending copies of a new book to all the relevant departments: the visual department, the auditory department, the emotional department, so that the book's essence is stored across the entire library, not just in one place. But this brings us back to our central mystery. Why, even after a memory has been successfully consolidated and shipped out to the grand archive of the neocortex, does it still fade? Why does the ink on these archived books seem to vanish over time? The answer lies at a much deeper, more microscopic level. It lies in the connections between our brain cells. It lies at the synapse. We've discussed before how memories are formed. Through a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP, when two neurons fire together, the connection, the synapse, between them becomes stronger. It is the carving of a pathway in a dense forest. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This is the biological basis for learning. But the brain, in its incredible efficiency, understands a fundamental truth. A forest with too many paths becomes a confusing, unusable thicket. The system requires not just a mechanism for strengthening connections, but also a mechanism for weakening and eliminating them. This process, the precise neurological opposite of LTP, is called long-term depression, or LTD, and the culling of unused connections is known as synaptic pruning. This is the why behind transience. A memory persists because the neural pathway that represents it is frequently activated, keeping the trail clear. When a memory is not revisited, when the pathway is not walked, the brain, in its wisdom, begins the process of reclamation. The synaptic connections weaken. The trail becomes overgrown with the weeds of new experiences. The once strong connection becomes harder and harder to activate, until eventually the path disappears entirely and the forest reclaims the land. The memory is, for all intents and purposes, gone. It is not a passive decay, it is an active biological process of forgetting. Modern neuroimaging has given us a stunning window into this process, even allowing us to predict which memories are destined to fade. Using a technique called event-related fMRI, scientists can now watch the brain in the very moment it encodes a new experience. In groundbreaking studies, like those mentioned by Schacter, participants were shown a long list of words or pictures while inside an fMRI scanner. Later, they were tested on which items they remembered and which they had forgotten. The researchers then rewound the tape, looking back at the brain activity at the exact moment each specific item was first seen. They found a remarkable correlation. The words and pictures that were later remembered were associated with significantly higher levels of activity in key brain regions during that initial encoding moment, specifically the left inferior frontal gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. In contrast, the items that were later forgotten had produced a much weaker initial brain response. This is a profound discovery. It means that transience, the fading of memory, is not just a story about what happens over time. It is also a story about the first few seconds of a memory's life. The strength of its birth predicts the length of its existence. Memories that are encoded with deep, focused, and robust neural activity are forged in a stronger fire. they are printed on better, more resilient photographic paper. Memories formed when our attention is divided, when we are distracted or disengaged, are printed with a weaker chemical solution. They are destined to fade, their fate sealed in the first moments of their creation. This is the neurological basis for why we forget the name of a person we just met at a loud party, but can remember a single, shocking sentence from a book we read years ago. The former was a whisper of neural activity. The latter was a symphony. The brain's fading mechanism operates on multiple timescales. The slow, graceful decay we've been discussing is long-term transience. But there is also a more immediate, more brutal form, short-term transience, which occurs in the leaky bucket of our working memory. This is the memory you use to hold a phone number in your head just long enough to dial it. This system, heavily reliant on the phonological loop in the left parietal lobe, is designed to hold a small amount of information for mere seconds before it vanishes. Damage to this area can result in a patient who can remember their childhood perfectly but cannot repeat back a short string of digits. This rapid forgetting is not a flaw, it's a feature that prevents our conscious mind from being cluttered, allowing us to focus on the task at hand. It is the brain's RAM constantly clearing itself to process new information. Both the slow fade of the archive and the rapid flush of the conscious mind are forms of transience, two different systems working towards the same goal, ensuring that our minds are not prisons of the past, but efficient, adaptive tools for navigating the present. For the entirety of this investigation so far, we have treated transience as a pathology, a flaw, a ghost in the machine that steals our most precious data. We have mapped its predictable decay with Ebbinghaus and dissected its neurological mechanisms at the synapse. The diagnosis seems clear. Our memory is a faulty instrument, destined to degrade, a beautiful photograph designed by a careless creator to fade over time. This is the intuitive, human conclusion. It is the source of our collective anxiety about forgetting. It is the reason we see memory loss as a failure of self. And it is, according to a deeper, more profound understanding of the brain, almost entirely wrong. We have been conducting an autopsy on what we assumed was a victim of time. But now we must ask a radical question. What if transience is not a sin at all? What if it is, in fact, one of the greatest virtues of our cognitive architecture? What if the slow, steady erosion of memory is not a bug, but the most critical, brilliantly designed feature of our operating system? To understand this, we must stop thinking of the brain as an archive and start thinking of it as a filter. A ruthless, efficient, and utterly essential filter designed for one primary purpose: to allow us to live and function in the present. The first and most obvious virtue of this great filter is the prevention of cognitive overload. Let us engage in a thought experiment. Imagine a mind without transience. Imagine a memory that is perfect, total, and permanent. Every face you've ever glanced at in a crowd, every meal you've ever eaten, every conversation you've ever overheard, every word on every page you've ever read, all of it stored with perfect fidelity, instantly accessible, forever. It sounds, at first, like a superpower. In reality, it would be a living nightmare. You would be a prisoner in a library with no exits and no librarian, where every book is open to the same page at once, screaming for your attention. How could you make a decision about what to eat for lunch today if the memory of the last 10,000 lunches you've eaten presented themselves with equal, vivid clarity? How could you focus on a conversation with a loved one if the trivial words of every stranger you've ever passed on the street echoed in your mind with the same intensity? This is not just a hypothetical. Science has given us a chilling portrait of this condition. In the early 20th century, the Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria studied a man named Solomon Shereshevsky, known simply as S. Shereshevsky was a mnemonist. He seemed incapable of forgetting. He could memorize vast, complex tables of numbers in minutes and recall them perfectly decades later. But his perfect memory was a profound curse. His mind was so cluttered with an endless torrent of specific, trivial details that he found it almost impossible to think abstractly. When he read a story, he would be so overwhelmed by the memory of the specific shape of the letters, the exact tone of his own voice reading them in his head, that he couldn't grasp the story's general plot or meaning. He couldn't recognize faces because the specific expression a person wore at one moment would be stored as a completely separate memory from their expression a moment later. He was drowning in an ocean of data. Forgetting, for him, was a desperate, conscious struggle. He would try to mentally burn the unwanted memories, to erase them from his mental blackboard, but they would persist. Shereshevsky's story is a terrifying glimpse into what a mind without transience would be like. A magnificent archive, perhaps, but a dysfunctional, paralyzed intellect. Transience, then, is the brain's janitorial service, the silent curator that clears away the clutter of yesterday so we have the cognitive space to navigate today. The second, more subtle virtue of forgetting is that it is the very mechanism that allows for higher-order thinking. It is what enables generalization and abstraction. To form a useful, abstract concept of a dog, your brain must forget the specific, unique details of every single dog it has ever encountered. It must forget the black spot on the Labrador down the street, the specific high-pitched bark of your cousin's poodle, the feel of your childhood terrier's fur. It must let go of these concrete particulars to extract the abstract gist: 4 legs, a tail, fur, a bark. This ability to generalize from specific instances is the bedrock of intelligence, creativity, and problem-solving. An artist learning to paint a forest doesn't render every single leaf on every tree. They capture the essence, the general form, the play of light and shadow. They forget the details to capture the truth. A system with perfect permanent memory, like Shereshevsky's, would be trapped in the tyranny of the specific. It would see 1,000 individual trees, but would be incapable of ever understanding the concept of a forest. Transience is the biological process that allows us to see the forest for the trees. It is the great filter that discards the noisy data of individual experiences to reveal the clean, elegant signal of a general principle. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, transience is the engine of our emotional healing. It is the foundation of our resilience. Consider the most painful moments of your life: a profound loss, a humiliating failure, a deep heartbreak. In the immediate aftermath, the memory is sharp, visceral, and all-consuming. It replays with an agonizing clarity. Now, imagine if that memory never faded. Imagine if the pain of that loss felt as raw and immediate 10 years later as it did on the first day. Life would become unbearable. We would be a species of emotional ghosts, forever chained to the moments of our greatest suffering, incapable of moving forward. Transience is the brain's mechanism of mercy. It does not erase the memory entirely, but it blunts its sharp emotional edge over time. It is the psychological equivalent of scar tissue forming over a wound. The wound happens, the pain is real, and the scar, the memory, remains as a reminder. But the scar does not bleed forever. The nerve endings dull. The raw, open wound closes. Transience allows the emotional charge of a negative memory to dissipate, transforming it from an active torment into a part of our history. It is this gentle fading that gives us the courage to take new risks, to be vulnerable again, to love again after loss. It is the brain's quiet insistence that the past, while informative, should not be a permanent prison for the present. So, when we re-examine this sin, we see a different picture. We see a system that is not flawed, but brilliantly adapted to the statistical structure of our environment. As Schacter argues, our brain is a rational system. It holds on to information that is recent and frequently used, because that information is the most likely to be relevant for our immediate survival and navigation. It lets go of old, unused information because it has become statistically irrelevant. Transience is not a bug. It is the silent, wise, and ruthlessly efficient librarian of the mind, constantly curating our vast collection to keep it useful, relevant, and emotionally bearable. It is the brain's profound gift of a future, a gift paid for by the selective, graceful letting go of the past. We have journeyed through the fading landscape of memory. We have stood in the quiet study of Hermann Ebbinghaus and watched him chart the elegant decay of knowledge. We have peered through the lens of the modern fMRI and witnessed the neurological autopsy of a lost memory at the synaptic level. And, in a final, counterintuitive twist, we have argued for the virtue of this decay, framing transience not as a flaw, but as the brain's great filter, a necessary and adaptive feature that protects us from cognitive chaos and allows for healing and abstract thought. To accept transience is to accept a fundamental truth of our biology. But this acceptance brings us to a critical crossroad. What of the knowledge we must retain? What about the language you are trying to learn, the complex skill you need to master for your career, the crucial facts for an exam that will define your future, or even just the precious, fleeting details of a conversation with a loved one that you want to hold on to forever? Are we simply helpless passengers, doomed to watch our most valued mental structures erode under the relentless tide of time? The answer is no. While we cannot stop the tide completely, we can become skilled engineers, building seawalls around the cities of knowledge we wish to protect. The battle against transience is not about achieving a perfect, permanent memory. That is a fantasy, the curse of Solomon Cherysheevsky. Instead, it is a strategic battle. It is about learning how to work with the architecture of our brain, not against it. It is about understanding the rules of our own operating system so that we can send a clear, powerful, and repeated signal to our hippocampus and neocortex. A signal that says, this information is different. This information is important. Do not let this photograph fade. Do not let this path become overgrown. This memory must be forged in steel. To do this, neuroscience has revealed three primary weapons, three antidotes to the elegant decay of time. The first, and by far the most powerful weapon, is active recall. This principle is simple in its description, but profound in its effect. Active recall is the process of actively and deliberately retrieving information from your own mind, rather than passively re-exposing yourself to it. It is the difference between reading a chapter in a textbook 5 times over and reading it once, closing the book, and forcing yourself to explain the core concepts aloud to an empty room. It is the difference between watching a tutorial video on a new skill and pausing it to try and perform the skill yourself without guidance. It is, in short, the act of struggle. Why is this struggle so effective? Because it directly engages the mechanism of memory formation we discussed earlier, long-term potentiation. When you passively reread a passage, your brain recognizes it with a pleasant, low-effort hum of familiarity. This creates a dangerous illusion of knowing, but it does very little to strengthen the actual neural pathway. You are merely looking at the map of the forest, but when you force yourself to recall information, you are sending an electrical signal down that specific neural pathway without a guide. You are forcing your way through the trail, clearing the weeds, stumbling, and finding the route. That act of effortful retrieval is the most potent trigger for the brain to strengthen that synaptic connection. Each successful recall is a signal to the system that this pathway is important, that it is likely to be needed again in the future. It is the neurological equivalent of lifting a heavy weight. The struggle itself is what builds the muscle. Passive review is like watching someone else work out. Active recall is doing the reps yourself. The second weapon works in perfect harmony with the first. It is spaced repetition. This is the art of timing. Our investigation into Hermann Ebbinghaus revealed the forgetting curve, that we forget most rapidly soon after learning. Spaced repetition is the strategic hack of this curve. Instead of cramming, reviewing information intensely in one long session, you space out your retrieval practice at increasing intervals. You might actively recall a concept an hour after learning it, then a day later, then 3 days later, then a week, then a month. Why is this rhythm so powerful? Because each time you revisit the memory, you are intervening at the most critical moment. right as the photograph is beginning to fade most severely. You are catching it, and with another act of active recall, you are redeveloping it, strengthening the chemical bonds of the engram. Each time you do this, the rate of subsequent fading becomes shallower. You're not just resetting the clock on the forgetting curve, you're fundamentally flattening the curve itself. The memory becomes more and more resistant to the decay of time with each spaced, effortful retrieval. This is why a language learned through daily practice over a year will last a lifetime, while a subject crammed for an exam a week before is likely to vanish a week after. The first was forged in steel through spaced reinforcement. The second was written in sand, destined to be washed away by the next tide. The third and final weapon is elaborative encoding. This is the art of creating meaning. We saw how Ebbinghaus used nonsense syllables to study memory in its purest form. But in the real world, our brains do not work with nonsense. They are meaning-making machines. They build knowledge not as isolated data points, but as a vast, interconnected web. Elaborative encoding is the process of deliberately connecting new information to the existing knowledge already stored in your brain. When you learn a new fact, don't leave it as an isolated island. Build bridges to it from the continents of knowledge you already possess. If you are learning a new concept in physics, don't just memorize the formula. Relate it to something you already understand. The motion of a ball, the working of a car engine. If you are learning a new name, associate it with the name of a friend or a famous person. This process is called elaboration. You are taking a simple, new neural pathway and weaving it into the complex, strong, pre-existing tapestry of your long-term memory. The more connections a memory has, the more retrieval paths lead to it. It is like building a new house. If it stands alone in a field, there is only one road to get there. But if you build roads connecting it to all the major cities and highways of your mind, you can reach it from countless different directions. When you struggle to find it down one path, your brain can simply try another. Use analogies, use metaphors, tell stories, transform abstract data into a rich, interconnected narrative. A memory with 1,000 connections is a memory that cannot be easily lost. So we arrive at the end of our first investigation, transience, the slow, inevitable fading of the past. We have seen that it is not a flaw, but a fundamental, even virtuous, feature of our cognitive design, a great filter that protects us from chaos and allows us to heal and to think. It is the default state of our minds, a powerful force of nature like erosion or a tide. It is not our enemy, it is a part of who we are. But we are not helpless. We are not merely passive observers of our own mental decay. By understanding the machinery of memory, we gain the power to influence it. We learn that the act of struggling to remember is the very act that strengthens memory. We learn that timing is everything, that spaced reinforcement can tame the forgetting curve. And we learn that meaning is the ultimate anchor, the web that holds our knowledge together. Through active recall, spaced repetition, and elaborative encoding, we can become active participants in our own minds. We can choose which memories to fight for, which pathways to keep clear. We can become the sculptors of our own neural architecture, consciously reinforcing the connections that define who we want to be and the knowledge we wish to carry with us. We cannot stop the tide of time, but we can learn to build sea walls around the cities of the mind we value most. Until next time, stay curious.